Hey everyone, I'm so glad to see you all. By the way, where are you watching from? I'm from Texas, America. Write in the comments, I look forward to your comments. It's so exciting to know where you're all from. The steady hum of the Los Angeles streets filled Malik's tiny apartment. Even with the windows closed, the noises found their way in sirens wailing in the distance. The chatter of late-night pedestrians, cars groaning to a stop at the red light. He liked to think of the sounds as the background score to his life, noisy, chaotic, and indifferent. It was a fitting soundtrack to the endless stream of rejections he'd endured over the years. Malik Jones sat at his chip desk, illuminated only by the dim yellow glow of a desk lamp. On the screen of his aging laptop was a single document, a screenplay that he had rewritten so many times it felt like his soul was embedded in every word. This one, he thought, had to be the one. But then he'd thought that about the last screenplay, and the one before that. For the past decade, Malik had been submitting scripts to every production company, every film competition, every Hollywood contact he could find. And for the past decade, he had received rejection after rejection. At first, the denials came with polite encouragements: "We appreciate your submission, but it's not quite the right fit for us." Then came the cold, impersonal rejections: "Thank you, but we've decided to go in another direction." And then the worst fate of all, silence. He knew the silence was not just indifference, but deliberate exclusion. He had attended enough industry mixers to know the truth behind Hollywood's carefully cultivated image of diversity. Studios weren't looking for new voices. They were looking for old voices in new packaging, white storytellers writing stories about Black lives, sanitized for mainstream audiences. Malik's scripts, by contrast, were raw, unflinching. He wrote about what he knew: single mothers working 2 jobs to keep the lights on, young Black men torn between ambition and survival, communities that were as beautiful as they were broken. But no one wanted those stories, not from someone like him. He ran his hand over his close-cropped hair and sighed. It was getting harder to summon the energy to keep going. Every submission felt like throwing a message in a bottle into the ocean, hoping anyone would care enough to read it. His phone buzzed. It was Darren. "Darren, yo. Any word on that thing with Synergy Studios?" Malik: "Nope." Radio silence. Darren: "Same here. Man, I swear they just trash our scripts the moment they see our names." Malik: "You know they do." Darren had been one of the few people who understood exactly what Malik was going through. They had both started as idealistic young writers, attending workshops and networking events, believing in the myth of meritocracy. But reality had taught them otherwise. Malik's jaw tightened as he remembered the time he had attended a pitch meeting at a mid-tier production company. He had spent weeks perfecting his pitch, rehearsing every line, every gesture. But the moment he introduced himself, the energy in the room shifted. The executives exchanged glances, their smiles becoming forced, their enthusiasm evaporating. "We love what you're trying to do here," one of them had said, leaning forward with a patronizing smile. "But we already have a Black drama in the pipeline." It was as if being Black meant he could only write about certain topics, and once one Black story was in the works, there was no room for any others. He had left the meeting feeling humiliated, vowing never to put himself in that position again. But here he was, still chasing the dream, still trying to be seen. His phone buzzed again. "Darren, what if we just, white it up?" Malik: "You serious?" Darren: "Why not? What have we got to lose?" The idea wasn't new. They had joked about it for years, sending in their scripts under white-sounding pseudonyms to see if it would make a difference. But it had always been just that, a joke. Until now. Malik stared at the screen. His hands itched to type. There was something deeply wrong about the idea, but there was also something liberating about it. It was a way to beat the system at its own game. And if the system was going to keep him out no matter what, then what did it matter how he played? "Fuck it," he muttered under his breath. He opened his script and changed the name on the cover page, Martin O'Connell. He deleted any references to the character's race. A scene where the protagonist's mother braids his hair became a bland conversation over cereal. He hated the changes, but he knew they were necessary. This wasn't just about getting his script read. It was about proving a point. He typed out a query email, attached the newly sanitized script, and hit send. The email notification came exactly 2 weeks later. Subject: "We love your script, let's talk." Malik read the message 3 times, his heart pounding in his chest. "Dear Martin, we absolutely loved your screenplay. It's rare to come across a story with such emotional depth and universal appeal. We would love to discuss the possibility of developing this project with you." Malik leaned back in his chair, a bitter smile curling on his lips. Universal appeal. Of course. It wasn't that his writing had suddenly improved, it was that they thought the writer was white. He showed the email to Darren, who burst out laughing. I told you, man, Darren said. All it takes is the right name. But Malik didn't laugh. The email was a victory, but it didn't feel like one. It felt like confirmation of everything he had known but didn't want to believe his talent had never been the issue. His blackness was. The Zoom meeting with the executives was surreal. Malik sat in front of his laptop, watching a group of white men and women gush over his screenplay, oblivious to the fact that the man behind the story wasn't who they thought he was. This is exactly the kind of fresh perspective we've been looking for, one executive said with a smile. It's authentic, but not too specific. You know what I mean? Malik did. What they meant was, it's authentic, but not too black. Another executive chimed in. We think this could be a real contender for award season, Martin. With a few minor tweaks, of course. We'll need to tone down some of the heavier moments to make it more accessible. Malik clenched his fists under the desk. They wanted to gut his story, strip it of the very elements that made it meaningful, all to make it palatable for a white audience. And they didn't even realize they were talking to a black man. But Malik forced a smile and nodded along. He knew he had to play the game, at least for now. He had come too far to turn back. As the meeting ended, one of the executives said, We'll be in touch soon, Martin. We can't wait to see where this journey takes us. Malik ended the call and sat in silence. He stared at his reflection in the dark screen, feeling like a ghost in his own story. This wasn't the victory he had imagined, but it was a start. And Malik Jones wasn't done yet. The next morning, Malik sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his laptop screen. His inbox was filling up with more emails than he'd ever received in his career, and all of them were addressed to Martin O'Connell. It was bizarre, infuriating, and exhilarating all at once, a mixture of rage and triumph that knotted in his stomach. He scrolled through the messages. Subject Martin, we love the script. Subject Martin, let's meet, are you free this week? Subject Martin O'Connell, you are a genius. He could almost hear their voices through the words, fawning and breathless. They thought they had discovered a bright new talent, someone they could groom and mold into their image. A white savior in the form of a screenwriter. And the worst part, they were clueless about how wrong they were. Malik took a deep breath, trying to calm the whirlpool inside him. For a moment, he considered replying to the emails as himself dropping the charade and exposing them for what they were. But what would that accomplish? They'd deny everything, brush it off as a misunderstanding, and the opportunity would vanish faster than it had appeared. No. If he wanted to change things, he'd have to play along for now. 2 days later, Malik found himself seated at a polished conference table inside Synergy Studios. The Zoom call had gone well enough that they insisted on meeting Martin in person. Malik knew it was a risky move, but he also knew the power of masks. He had spent his entire life wearing one, smiling politely when his white colleagues made offhanded comments about race, laughing at jokes that stung like barbed wire, playing the role of the non-threatening black guy to avoid being labeled angry. This meeting was no different. He was Martin O'Connell, now a white writer with just the right touch of sensitivity to tell stories that made white audiences feel good about themselves. Malik adjusted his posture, kept his face neutral, and prepared to meet the enemy in their own den. The room was bright, cold, and sterile, with walls lined with posters from Synergy's previous hits, uplifting dramas, rom-coms featuring diverse but non-threatening casts, and biopics about civil rights leaders always directed by white filmmakers. A small group of executives entered the room, each of them radiating practiced warmth. Martin, a tall man with slick back hair and a too-wide smile, extended his hand. It's so great to finally meet you. I'm Peter Thompson, head of development here at Synergy. Malik shook his hand, careful to maintain the easy, confident demeanor he imagined Martin O'Connell would have. Thanks for having me. Peter gestured to the others. This is Claire, our head of marketing, and Jonathan from production. We've been obsessed with your script, haven't we? Claire nodded eagerly. It's just so refreshing. It has a real sense of humanity, you know. Malik forced a smile. He knew exactly what she meant. They spent the next hour discussing the project in vague but enthusiastic terms. Malik listened as they dissected his story, offering suggestions for changes that made his skin crawl. We think the ending could be a bit lighter, Claire said, flipping through her copy of the script. Maybe the mother doesn't have to struggle so much. It's a bit heavy for mainstream audiences. Yeah, Peter added. And we were thinking, what if the son's dreams aren't tied to his environment? Like maybe instead of becoming a local entrepreneur, he wants to be, I don't know, a marine biologist or something. Something more aspirational. Malik felt the muscles in his jaw tighten. They were gutting his story, stripping it of everything that made it real. But he couldn't afford to push back, not yet. So he nodded along, taking notes and pretending to consider their ideas. The meeting ended with promises of further discussions and champagne toasts to the project's bright future. Malik left the studio feeling like he'd just survived a hostage negotiation. As soon as he stepped outside, he pulled out his phone and texted Darren. Malik, it's worse than I thought. They want to turn my characters into Disney mascots. Darren, of course they do. Stay strong, bruh. Play the game. Malik, I'm playing, but I don't know how long I can keep this up. He pocketed his phone and stood on the sidewalk, watching the world rush past him. People walked by without noticing him, just another black man blending into the city's background noise. He realized with a bitter laugh that Martin O'Connell would never have to feel this way. Martin would glide through life, doors opening for him wherever he went. His talent celebrated instead of scrutinized. Malik had spent his entire career trying to prove himself in a world that was determined not to see him. And now, as Martin O'Connell, he was finally being seen. But it wasn't him they were seeing, it was the mask. Over the next few weeks, the project picked up momentum. Malik juggled meetings with producers, agents, and directors, all of them eager to work with the talented Martin. He found himself slipping deeper into the role, saying the right things, nodding at the right times, becoming the version of himself they wanted to see. But the deeper he went, the harder it became to maintain the facade. Every conversation was a reminder of how little the industry thought of people like him. Every note on his script was a slap in the face, a reminder that his real story wasn't good enough unless it was filtered through whiteness. The frustration began to eat away at him. He stayed up late at night, rewriting scenes to meet the studio's demands, hating every word he typed. His phone became a lifeline to Darren, who kept him grounded with late-night calls and texts. You can't quit now, man, Darren said during one of their conversations. If you walk away, they win. You've got to see this through. Malik knew Darren was right. But knowing didn't make it any easier. One night, after yet another exhausting round of rewrites, Malik sat alone in his apartment, staring at the latest version of his script. It felt like a stranger's work, something hollow and lifeless. He thought about his mother, who had worked double shifts as a nurse to put him through school. She had believed in his talent, even when no one else did. You've got a gift, baby, she used to say. Don't let anyone tell you different. But what would she think if she knew what he was doing now? Would she be proud of him for finding a way in? Or would she be ashamed that he had to pretend to be someone else to do it? The weight of the lie pressed down on him, suffocating. He had thought that wearing the mask would be easy, but every time he put it on, it felt tighter, crushing the air from his lungs. He knew he couldn't keep it up forever. But he also knew that if he took the mask off now, everything he had worked for would disappear. And so Malik kept going, one foot in front of the other, one lie at a time, because that was the only way to survive in a world that refused to see him. For now, he was Martin O'Connell, and Martin had work to do. The sun had barely risen, but Malik was already awake, sitting at his desk, scrolling through a dozen emails marked urgent. The studio was moving at a breakneck pace now that they believed Martin O'Connell was their next golden boy. Deadlines came with suffocating precision. Every day, Malik woke up earlier, stayed up later, chasing a dream that no longer felt like his. His apartment looked like the aftermath of a storm, takeout containers scattered across the floor, half-empty water bottles on every surface, and sticky notes with endless script revisions plastered over the walls. He stared at the screen, the glow from his laptop illuminating his tired face, his inbox filled with directives from producers demanding changes. Peter Thompson, Synergy Studios. Martin, quick note. Can you remove that scene where the mother talks about systemic racism? It feels a little heavy-handed. We want the audience to relate, not feel uncomfortable. Malik clenched his fists until his knuckles whitened. Not feel uncomfortable? His entire life had been uncomfortable navigating a world that saw his very existence as a problem. Yet these executives wanted to cherry-pick pieces of his reality, keeping only the parts that fit neatly within their polished narratives. He deleted Peter's email without replying. Then, out of spite, he opened the script and made the scene even more raw. Malik wrote it the way his mother would have told it, unapologetically honest, with the bitterness of lived experience. But as soon as he finished typing, the doubt crept in. Would they reject the changes? Would they drop the project altogether if he pushed too hard? And if they did, what would that mean for everything he had fought for? He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his hands over his face. The lines between Malik Jones and Martin O'Connell were becoming dangerously blurred. Every decision felt like a battle between who he was and who he had to pretend to be. His phone buzzed. It was Darren. Darren, you up? Malik, barely. Darren, they hitting you with more notes. Malik, yeah, same old shit. Water it down, make it universal. Darren, man, I told you this was coming. They want you to tell a black story without making anyone feel black. Malik, I don't know how much more of this I can take. There was a long pause before Darren replied. Darren, you're already in too deep, bro. They'll figure it out if you quit now. Ride this wave and finish the damn thing. Then blow the whole system up once you're in. Malik knew Darren was right. But knowing didn't make it any easier. A meeting of masks. 2 days later, Malik sat in another meeting at Synergy Studios. The room was a carefully curated vision of modern sheet glass walls, minimalist furniture, and espresso machines that no one actually used. Across the table sat Peter, Claire, and a new face of director named Vince Garrett, who was being brought in to helm the project. Vince was exactly what Malik had expected, a young, scruffy-looking white man with an air of self-importance. His indie films had received glowing reviews at Sundance, and he carried himself like someone who believed his work was changing the world. We're so lucky to have Vince on board, Peter said, beaming. His vision aligns perfectly with what we're trying to achieve here. Malik offered a tight-lipped smile, trying to suppress the wave of resentment rising in his chest. He had written every word of this story, poured his soul into it, but now it was Vince's vision that mattered. Vince leaned forward, flipping through the script with an air of casual authority. I really love what you've done here, Martin. There's just one thing I think we could explore a bit more. Maybe we soften the mother's struggles. Like instead of working 2 jobs, she could just have a quirky hobby she's passionate about. It gives her character a bit more charm. Malik's jaw tensed. Charm? His mother didn't need charm. She needed rest. She needed to sleep more than 3 hours a night. But those weren't the kinds of stories Hollywood wanted to tell. That's an interesting idea, Malik said, his voice flat. Peter grinned, clearly pleased with Malik's compliance. See? This is why we love working with you, Martin. You're so open to collaboration. Malik smiled through clenched teeth. Collaboration. That was what they called it when they stole your story and twisted it into something unrecognizable. The fracture. The pressure was relentless. As the weeks passed, Malik found himself spiraling deeper into a pit of exhaustion and self-loathing. The lies were becoming harder to manage. Every interaction as Martin O'Connell felt like a betrayal of himself. But every moment as Malik Jones felt like a betrayal of the dream he'd been chasing since he was a kid. He barely slept. When he did, his dreams were filled with images of his mother, her face etched with disappointment. She would look at him, shake her head, and say, "Why are you hiding, baby? Why are you ashamed?" Malik would wake up drenched in sweat, the weight of her imagined words crushing him. The breaking point came one evening during a dinner meeting with the studio execs. They had chosen an upscale restaurant, one of those places where the prices weren't listed on the menu, and everyone spoke in hushed, self-important tones. Peter raised his glass in a toast. To Martin O'Connell, the future of Synergy Studios. The table erupted in applause. Malik forced a smile, lifting his own glass. But inside, he felt like he was drowning. As the night wore on, the conversation drifted to race. It was a topic the executives handled with the clumsy precision of people trying not to say the wrong thing. I just think, Claire said, swirling her wine, that it's so important to tell stories that bridge communities. You know, stories that show we're all the same, deep down. Malik bit his tongue so hard he tasted blood. Exactly, Peter chimed in. That's what we love about your script, Martin. It's not too political. It's just human. Malik's head pounded. He excused himself from the table and stepped outside, the cool night air hitting him like a slap. He leaned against the wall of the restaurant, sucking in deep breaths, trying to calm the storm inside him. His phone buzzed. A text from Darren. Darren, you good, bro? Malik. No. Darren, what's going on? Malik, I don't know who I am anymore. The breaking point. Malik stood there for what felt like hours, wrestling with himself. He had spent his entire life chasing a dream that now felt like a nightmare. He thought about his mother, about Darren, about every rejection letter he had ever received. He thought about the people who would never know his name, even if his script won every award in Hollywood. And he thought about the lie. The lie that had opened doors but was slowly killing him inside. For a moment he considered walking away, leaving it all behind and disappearing into obscurity. But that would mean letting them win. It would mean letting them believe they were right, that a story like his could only succeed if told by someone else. No, he couldn't let that happen. Malik pulled out his phone and opened his email. His heart pounded as he typed a message to Peter and the rest of the studio team. Subject: truth. He stared at the screen for a long moment, his finger hovering over the send button. Then, with a deep breath, he hit send. When Malik hit send, the weight on his chest didn't disappear. If anything, it grew heavier, pressing down as if daring him to regret his choice. He watched the email notification disappear from his screen, knowing it was already too late to undo what he had set in motion. In the silence of his cramped apartment, all Malik could hear was his own ragged breathing. He closed the laptop, leaned back in his chair, and stared at the ceiling. His heart pounded in his ears. He had spent his entire life holding his breath, and now, for better or worse, he had finally exhaled. Corporate chaos. The next morning, chaos descended on Synergy Studios. Malik's email, a short but devastating confession, had landed in the inboxes of every key player in the project. Email excerpt. Dear Peter, Claire, and Vince. This is not Martin O'Connell. My name is Malik Jones. I wrote the script you're about to produce, and I've spent my life watching people like you tell us that our stories only matter if they come from a white voice. You wanted Martin because you didn't think Malik could be good enough. Now you have a choice to make. I'm done playing along. Peter Thompson read the email 3 times, his face draining of color. He fumbled for his phone and dialed Claire. You see this? Peter asked the moment Claire picked up. Please tell me this is some kind of prank. Claire's voice was tight with panic. It's not. Within hours, Synergy Studios was in full damage control mode. An emergency meeting was scheduled. PR teams were looped in. Lawyers whispered behind closed doors. The higher-ups debated furiously, should they issue a public statement? Could they bury the revelation? Or, worst of all, could Malik sue them for discrimination and drag the entire studio through a scandal? Vince Garrett sat in stunned silence during the meeting, flipping the printed email in his hands, as if the words would change on the 4th read. He had never thought about who Martin O'Connell really was. Why would he? Writers were invisible, after all. They were just names on a page, faceless instruments to fuel his next vision. Peter slammed his hand on the conference table. We need to contain this. If this gets out... Claire interrupted, her voice cold. It's already out. The news breaks. Malik had barely gotten through his morning coffee when the text started flooding in. Darren, yo. You're trending. Malik, what? Darren, they leaked it, man. Everyone knows. Malik grabbed his phone and opened Twitter. His name, Malik Jones, was everywhere. The hashtags Expose Hollywood and Black Ink trended within minutes. News sites and blogs churned out clickbait headlines. Hollywood studio fooled by black writer's pseudonym. Martin O'Connell was a lie, but his script was the real deal. Racial bias exposed in Synergy Studios' upcoming project. The takes came fast and furious. Some writers applauded Malik's bravery, calling him a hero for exposing Hollywood's hypocrisy. Others accused him of deceit, saying he had tricked the studio and deserved whatever fallout came his way. By noon, Synergy released a carefully worded statement. We are committed to diversity, inclusion, and the amplification of underrepresented voices. We regret any misunderstandings surrounding the development process of this project and remain excited to collaborate with Mr. Jones moving forward. Malik read the statement with a bitter laugh. Misunderstanding. That was what they called it. As if it were a simple oversight, a momentary lapse in judgment, not an indictment of an entire system built on exclusion. His phone buzzed again. It was an email from Peter Thompson. Subject: we need to talk. A meeting without masks. 2 days later, Malik sat across from Peter and Claire in a private meeting room at Synergy Studios. No lawyers. No PR. Just the 3 of them. Peter looked like he hadn't slept in days. Claire's usual polished demeanor had cracked, revealing a layer of barely concealed frustration. Peter cleared his throat. Malik. Or, I guess, Martin. Malik, he corrected, leaning back in his chair. Let's not play games. Peter sighed. Malik, we've got a situation here. You understand that, right? Yeah, Malik said. You do. Claire crossed her arms. Do you have any idea what you've done? This project, this studio is under fire because of you. Malik met her glare without flinching. Because of me? Or because you couldn't see past your own bias? Peter held up his hands, trying to placate both sides. Look, let's all take a breath. This doesn't have to get ugly. Malik leaned forward, his voice low and steady. It already is. The only reason you bought my script was because you thought a white man wrote it. Admit that. Peter's silence was answer enough. Claire's voice was ice. What do you want, Malik? An apology? A parade? We're offering you the chance to move forward with the project. Isn't that what you wanted? Malik stared at her. I wanted a fair shot. I wanted you to see me. Not some fake version of me. Me. For a moment, no one spoke. The weight of the truth hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The fallout. The project didn't implode, but it didn't survive unscathed either. Several key investors pulled out, unwilling to risk being associated with the scandal. Vince Garrett, ever the opportunist, jumped ship to direct another film, leaving the project without a leader. Peter and Claire scrambled to salvage what they could, offering Malik full creative control in a desperate attempt to save face. But the damage was done. No amount of rebranding could erase the stain of what had happened. Malik spent the following weeks navigating interviews, panel discussions, and social media debates. Everyone wanted to hear his story until they didn't. The support he received was fleeting, conditional. Some people praised him for exposing the industry's flaws, but others accused him of being a troublemaker, a fraud. The same people who had called him a genius when they thought he was Martin O'Connell now questioned his talent. As if his words had somehow lost value the moment his identity was revealed. Through it all, Darren stood by his side, his unwavering presence a lifeline in the storm. You did the right thing, he said more than once. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. But Malik wasn't sure anymore. He had fought for his place at the table, but the victory felt hollow. The industry had been forced to confront its biases, but it hadn't changed. Not really. Rebuilding, months passed. The project, now stripped of its original team, went into limbo. Malik considered walking away, burning the script and leaving Hollywood behind, but something in him refused to quit. He spent late nights rewriting the story, crafting it into something truer, bolder. This time he wasn't writing for the studio. He was writing for himself. When he finished, he sent the script to Darren. Darren called him the next day, his voice full of pride. This is it, man. This is the story you were meant to tell. Malik smiled for the first time in weeks. The months following the scandal were an endless blur of noise and silence. Malik's world felt like it had been split down the middle. One side was chaos, news cycles still ringing every last drop from the story, journalists eager to stir controversy, anonymous threats in his inbox accusing him of everything from fraud to reverse racism. The other side was suffocating silence. Producers who once clamored to meet Martin O'Connell were now distant. Scripts he submitted vanished into the void without a reply. His name, his real name, had become a liability in an industry that demanded control over every narrative. Malik had wanted to shake the system, but now he found himself on the outside, wondering if the cost had been too high. He spent long nights alone, replaying every choice he'd made. There were moments he felt like calling Darren and saying, I shouldn't have done it. I should have just stayed Martin. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. He hadn't destroyed his life, he had destroyed the illusion that he could thrive by hiding himself. What haunted him now was the emptiness left behind. If the world refuses to change, what do I have left? A sudden opportunity. Weeks turned into months. Malik was on the verge of giving up when he received an email that caught him off guard. It was from a small independent production company run by a black woman named Yvonne Mathis, who had been following his story from the sidelines. Subject: a real offer. Yvonne's message was brief but direct. Malik, I saw what they did to you and I know how this industry works. I also know the story you wrote deserves to be told, but not on their terms. If you're interested, let's talk. I think we can build something better. Malik read the email 3 times before he responded. When he met Yvonne in person, it felt like stepping into a different world. Her office was nothing like the sterile, polished studios he had become used to. The walls were lined with posters from independent film, stories told without compromise. There were no empty platitudes about diversity. Just a quiet determination to make something real. Yvonne greeted him with a warm smile. "I've been where you are," she said without preamble. "They ignore us, push us to the margins. But we don't have to wait for their permission." For the first time in months, Malik felt something he thought he'd lost hope. A new way forward. Working with Yvonne was unlike anything Malik had experienced. There were no endless meetings where executives picked apart his work. No emails telling him to water down the message. Instead, he found himself surrounded by people who wanted the truth, who weren't afraid to sit in the discomfort that truth required. Yvonne gave him a simple directive: tell the story you want to tell. And so Malik rewrote the script again, but this time it felt different. He stripped away every compromise, every scene that had been softened for the comfort of audiences who didn't understand his world. He wrote about his mother the way she deserved to be remembered, not as a charming side character, but as a complex woman who fought every day to survive. The new script wasn't just better, it was alive. Every word crackled with anger and love, pain and pride. Malik poured himself into every page, refusing to hold anything back. When he finished, Yvonne read the script in one sitting. When she was done, she looked up at him, her eyes shining. "This," she said softly, "is going to change everything, the roadblocks." But even with Yvonne's backing, the road ahead was anything but smooth. Financing was scarce. Distributors were hesitant. Some investors saw the project as too risky, while others wanted editorial control over the story. Malik found himself back in familiar territory, battling against a system that wanted to shape his narrative into something more palatable. At one point, an investor suggested adding a white co-lead to balance the story. Malik refused outright. "Balance," he said, his voice cold. "This isn't about balance. This is about truth." The investor walked away, and with him went a significant chunk of the funding. Yvonne shrugged it off. "We don't need him," she said simply. "We'll find another way." And they did. Malik and Yvonne turned to crowdfunding, putting out a call to the public. They told people the truth: Hollywood didn't want this story. But we do, and we need your help to tell it. The response was overwhelming. Donations poured in from people all over the world, people who were tired of seeing their stories erased, who believed in the power of truth. Within weeks, they had raised enough to start production. The set feels like home. The first day on set felt surreal. Malik stood among the cast and crew, watching as scenes he had written came to life. There were no Vince Garretts here, no directors trying to reshape the story into something it wasn't. The actors, many of whom had lived experiences that mirrored the characters they portrayed, brought a depth to their performances that took Malik's breath away. For the first time, Malik felt like he belonged, not as an imposter, not as someone pretending to be someone else, but as himself. The shoot wasn't easy. They worked long hours with a shoestring budget, facing challenges at every turn. But Malik didn't mind. For the first time in his life, he was creating without compromise, and it felt like freedom. The release. When the film was finally finished, Malik and Yvonne submitted it to every major film festival they could think of. To their surprise, it was accepted into several, and not just the smaller ones. The film was set to premiere at Sundance, and there was already buzz surrounding it. But Malik knew better than to get his hopes up. He had seen too many black filmmakers celebrated in niche spaces only to be ignored by the industry at large. On the night of the premiere, Malik stood in the back of the theater, his heart pounding. As the lights dimmed and the opening scene flickered across the screen, he held his breath. The audience was silent throughout the film, not the kind of silence born from disinterest, but the kind that comes from being deeply moved. When the credits rolled, there was a beat of stillness, followed by a thunderous wave of applause. Malik felt tears sting his eyes. The impact. Hey, the film didn't just win awards, it started conversations. People talked about it not as a token diverse film, but as a masterpiece in its own right. Malik was no longer an invisible name on a script. He was a filmmaker with a voice, and people were finally listening. But more than the accolades, what mattered most to Malik was the people who reached out to him, people who saw themselves in the story he had told. A young black writer sent him a message that said, "Thank you for showing me it's possible." Malik smiled. This was why he had fought, a future without masks. Months later, Malik found himself back at his desk working on his next project. He no longer felt the need to hide behind a pseudonym. His name, Malik Jones, was enough. There were still battles to fight. Hollywood hadn't changed overnight, The same biases still lurked beneath the surface, and Malik knew he would face resistance every step of the way. But he wasn't afraid anymore. He had learned how to tell his story without compromise, and he knew he wasn't alone. As he typed the first words of his new script, Malik felt something he hadn't felt in a long time.